Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We're currently in Numbers chapter 21. Again, we are making our way through Israel's journey through the wilderness, and we're coming to the end of the 40-year wilderness journey, which God had decreed that the first generation that came out of Egypt, that they will all die in the wilderness, that they, because of their unbelief, they would not enter into the promised land, except for two, Joshua and Caleb. And so far, some of the more notable people who have died would be Miriam and Aaron. So Eleazar, Aaron's son, is now the high priest. So let's continue on. Numbers chapter 21 says, when the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in Negev, heard that Israel was coming on the Atram road, he fought against Israel and captured some prisoners. Then Israel made a vow to the Lord, if he would deliver this people into our hands, we would completely destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's request, and the Canaanites were defeated. Excuse me. And Israel completely destroyed them and their cities. So they named the place Hormah. Now, some of these, we're going to see several defeats of, these would be like big kings, big dynasties here that they're going to destroy. One of the reasons why God is doing this, and even one of the reasons why God is sort of leading them into battle, is to teach them, one, to rely on Him, to trust in Him, and to show them that God's strength and power would be with Israel. It says, verse 4, Then they set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea and bypassed the land of Edom, but the people became impatient because of the journey. Now, you remember in the last chapter, Edom refused to let them pass through. So it kind of makes the journey, they have to kind of go around. It would have been a simpler way, an easier path. Now, one of the reasons why God is not, Edom is going to get his turn, but God, remember, had some promise with Esau himself, with Esau himself. When we see how God is dealing, one of the things we need to understand is that God is sovereign over the entire earth. The Bible itself focuses on, of course, Israel. But also we need to kind of remember that there is an entire world out there, kingdoms, people, right? You can say ethnicities, races, right? Of people that are out there. But the Bible's focus is not on that. The Bible's focus is on Israel. So sometimes as you're reading the Bible, you don't see that. What we also don't see is that God is sovereignly working His plan. In other words, the entire earth is the Lord, and God is doing things all over the earth. It's just not kind of known. So one of the things where Israel is concerned, there's going to come a time when He says that you can't invade this land because their sin is not up. I'm not having given it to you yet. Okay, but that shows God's sovereignty. You know, it shows His sovereignty, that behind the scenes, and we see that in the book of Daniel, where the sovereignty of God, okay, that He's ruling behind the entire earth. Now, some people may criticize that, but you only can criticize that because you're not in the presence of God. Let me just say that. All right, verse 5. The people spoke against God in Moses. Why have you led us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? Now, again, some of these people, I'm going to say, I assume, some of these people who, again, these would be 60 years old and up. 60 years old and up. and they're the ones who are going to die in the wilderness. So within the next year, right, approximately a year, a lot of these people complaining, they're going to die. Verse 5 again, the people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you led us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, no water, and we detest this wretched food. So they're complaining in their murmurs. Now remember, some of these people were 20 years old, okay, at the time of the Exodus. So they remember, right? They remember Egypt, so they would remember how horrible things were, and here they are glorifying, as if Egypt was, let's go back to Egypt because it was so great for us, which is mind-boggling. Verse 6, then the Lord sent poisonous snakes among the people, and they bit them, so that many Israelites died. Right? Now, here's another thing. Has it not been for the mercy of God, we would all be consumed. I remember there was this TV show a few years back called Zoo, and the premise of the story was that something happened where all of the animals, right, turned on human beings and started attacking the human beings, and in some respect they were going to take over the earth. Now, from a biblical standpoint, the only way that can happen is God's fear that He put in animals. The fear of man would be removed. Okay, that's just I say that because notice all these snakes starting to bite the people, and especially even around Israel, there were lions, bears, all these things that had not God in His mercy. Okay, had not God in His mercy hold off man, this stuff would happen. We would see more atrocities like this. Verse 7. The people came to Moses and said, we have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord so that He will take the snakes away from us. And Moses interceded from the people. Interceded for the people. So they, it's amazing if you think about this, as I said right now, what could be, in other words, had it not been for God's mercy. I'm thinking about even sometimes some of the things that have happened, for example, just in the last year with me, that had it not been for God's mercy. Okay. Now, verse 8. Also, notice how merciful God is. And you kind of see that on the one hand, we see God's sternness. But remember, His sternness is because of the people's sin. Now, and I emphasize that because whenever you hear about the God of the Old Testament, right? The God of wrath. You always hear that term, but you never hear that wrath was always in response to the people's sin. In this case here, we see that they complained against God. They cursed God. But then you also see the mercy of God. Verse 8, then the Lord said to Moses, make a snake image and mount it on the pole. And anyone who is bitten, when anyone who is bitten looks at it, he will recover. So Moses made a bronze snake and mounted it on a pole. Whenever someone was bitten and he looked at the bronze snake, he recovered. Now this has become one of the most controversial questions with people. Why would God tell Israel to make a bronze snake? And is this a pagan symbol, a pagan image? So here's the question: It is not a pagan symbol. It is in direct result to God's command. So in other words, they went to worship it, right? They were not to worship it as God, but they were to look at it in obedience to God's command. Later on, we're going to see this bronze snake will become a pagan idol. Okay. So the question is, why did God do it? Well, God did it because because he told him that. That would be the means of being healed from a poisonous bite of the snake. That's why. Now, it is interesting in that these are very idolatrous people. However, if you got bit by a snake and then you looked at the bronze snake, the healing of your snake bite wouldn't produce a pagan worship of the image, but a worship of the true God. Okay? But it is, like that this is something that God would tell him to do that. Now, by the way, anything God tells them to do, think about the cross. Think about how we look at the cross, okay? How crosses have become relics. All right, anyway, I digress. Verse 10 says, the Israelites set out and camped at Oboth. They set out from Oboth and camped in Lai-Abrim in the wilderness of the borders of Moab on the east. From there, they went and camped in Zered Valley. They set out from there and camped on the other side of Arnon River, in the wilderness that extend from the Amorite borders, because Arnon was the Moabite border between Moab and Amorites. Therefore, it is stated in the book of the Lord's wars. Now, this is interesting. I don't know if we have this book anywhere, the book of the Lord's wars, or if this is kind of known by another name. Titles of the written books of the Bible are very scarce. Most of the titles of the names, in other words, of the books, we don't have. These titles were sort of added by translators. Okay? But if we were to have this somewhere, the book of the Lord's wars, somewhere, there may be a book. Of course, it would go to the scrutiny of being tested in terms of theologically. But it's kind of interesting here. It says, Rehab in Sapon, and the ravens of Anan, even the slopes of the ravines extend to the side of Arab and lie along the borders of Moab. Then it says, from there they went to Beer, the well of the Lord, the well of the Lord told Moses about, gather the people so I may give them water. And Israel sang this song, spring up, well, sing to it. The princes dug the well, the nobles of the people hollowed out, and with the scepter and with their staffs. Now we'll get into more of these kind of songs, especially when we get to the book of songs, but this was actually a song that they would sing. Okay. Then it says, they went up from the wilderness of Mattanah, and from Mattanah to Nathaniel, and to Nahal, and then Nahal to Bemoth, from Bemoth to the valley of in the territory of Moab near the Pixai highlands that overtook the wasteland. And again, forgive me, because I know I am not pronouncing these right. Let's see, verse 19. From verse 20. Okay, I'm going to read verse 20 again. From Bemoth to the valley of the territory of Moab, near the Pixai highlands that overlook the wastelands. Verse 21, Israel sends messengers to Sihon, the king of the Amorites. Let us travel through your land. We won't go into the fields or the vineyards. We won't drink any of the wells of water. We will travel the king's highway until we travel through your territory. But Sihon would not let Israel travel through his territory. Instead, they gathered his whole army and went out to confront Israel in the wilderness. And when he came to Jahaz, he fought against Israel. And Israel struck him with the sword and took possession of his land from Enah to Jabbok, but only up to the Amorite borders, because it was fortified. Israel took all of the cities and lived in all of these Amorite cities, including Heshbon and all its villages. And Heshbon was the city of the Sihon king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and had taken control of all his land, and as far as Enon. Therefore the poets say, "Come, Heshbon, let us rebuild. Let the city of Sihon be restored. For fire came out of Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sihon. It consumed Ar of Moab, and the lords of Enon heights. Woe to you, Moabs! You have been destroyed. People of Shemash, he gave up his sons as refuge and his daughters into captivity. And Sihon, the Amorite king, we threw them down. Heshbon has been destroyed as far as Dibon. We caused desolation of Nephar, which reaches as far as Medeba." So Israel lived in the Amorites' land. After Moses sent spies to Gezer, Israel captured its villages and drove out the Amorites who lived there. Now, this is not the promised land. Okay? Verse 33, they then turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, came out against them with his whole army to do battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to Moses, "Do not fear him, for I have handed him over to you along with his whole army and his land. Do not do to him as you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon." Now, whenever the Lord says, "Don't fear him," understand it's because they are afraid. In other words, he never tells us anything just because he has nothing better to say. But it is meant for words to strengthen them too. One of the ways we receive strength from the Lord is through his word. Okay? It's through his word. Verse 35, so they struck him, his sons, and his whole family, until no one was left, and they took possessions of his land. Now, this would be, again, just a temporary kind of situation right here. This is not the promised land, nor were they to get comfortable in it. Now, later we're going to see that there will be a couple of the tribes who will settle on the, I think it's the west side of the Jordan, and we'll read that when we get to them, though. The primary purpose of this is really to strengthen Israel's faith that God is with them, that they do not have to fear. Okay, they do not have to fear the surrounding armies. And as we will later see, had it not been for God's strength and God's power, they would have been easily defeated by Sihon and the king of Og. So these two kings were very powerful, and God's going to remind them of that later. All right, guys, see you in chapter 22 in the next study. See you then.